Thank you for tuning in to the WOLA podcast. I'm Adam Isaacson, and I'm here to remind you that these podcasts are free. We keep them ad free, but WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, is an independent organization. We operate entirely on gifts and donations from people like you. So please support our work. The easiest way to do that is simply by visiting WOLA.org and clicking on donate right there at the very top. So this is an episode recorded on June 25th, 2026, Thursday. I sat down over Zoom with Elijah Maurus, who's an attorney based in Tijuana, who's been working principally with the LGBTQ plus asylum seekers in that city since 2018. We go into some detail, roughly in sort of a south to north manner, talking about the many security and basic rights challenges faced by LGBTQ migrants trying to make their way to safety in the United States as they transit Mexico. Really, all migrants too, but it is especially dangerous for this subset of the migrant population. But then we talk about the serious deterioration of safety in the United States for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers and the difficulty of getting asylum for them and really for everyone else in the United States system since Donald Trump's return to office in January of last year. Some of the measures being taken to leave people terrifyingly unprotected are very visible. The suspension of the right to asylum border-wide on January 20th, 2025. The Supreme Court decisions, like the two devastating ones today, which we do talk about, which allow CBP to prevent asylum seekers from accessing official border crossings, which upheld the removal of temporary protected status for 350,000 citizens of Haiti. But there is another sort of death by 1,000 cuts going on beneath the surface that's not making headlines, that a lot of people don't see. Everything ranging from a whole bunch of procedural technicalities to installing very anti-asylum judges to making the detention system as miserable as possible and sort of out of view in order to get people to give up their cases. The fight to protect LGBTQ plus people and to protect all non-citizens who need protection in the United States it's lost some key battles in the last year and a half. But people like Elijah are doing the work under difficult circumstances. And he does a really clear job of explaining here what's happening and what the stakes are. Let's listen. Elijah Maurus, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, we've never met in person, but I've seen you in a lot of coalition meetings over the years and really appreciate your contributions and your work. So it's great to have the chance to actually have a conversation. It's a bit of a fraught day. We're recording on June 25th, and we may get into that. But before we do that, I'll just explain that because I haven't really heard. I mean, you work in the Tijuana, San Diego area. You're representing many clients who really need help. What brought you to this?
Yeah, not a linear trajectory for me. I moved to Tijuana from Brooklyn, New York. I'm originally from North Idaho, went to law school in New York and did a couple different things, but mostly was a criminal defense attorney. Over the years, I did a lot of immigration kind of volunteer stuff. And certainly my job would intersect with criminal immigration interface. So people who are non-citizens get arrested, and that requires an analysis. But not my principal work. I did a lot of some of the work for the Committee to Protect Journalists. And there was still is a project called the Sex Workers Project at the Urban Justice Center that did a lot of work around T visas for LGBT folks. And so my foot was in the water, but it wasn't my primary work. And so it's a weird story to tell in a way, but so as Trump's rhetoric towards immigration really heated up, I mean, it was always there. It was from the descent down the escalator. Obviously, It's always been a pillar of his, whatever you call it. But towards, I guess it was 2018, there was an increasing amount of caravans. It was not always happened. Caravans is essentially a group of people traveling together, and that's always happened.
It's safer that way to get across Mexico.
Yeah. But certainly it started to be more politicized. And from Brooklyn, I was more involved there were smaller LGBT caravans. So when I say caravan, I'm talking 10 people sometimes 40. And I was in a very long distance role supporting just a little bit like I always did in certain ways. But when the very large caravan arrived in Tijuana, I had already been involved over the course of that year. There had been another caravan in June. And
this was the one at the end of the year going into 2019.
So there was a call for volunteers, and it was in November. And I was talking to a friend. I'm like, well, we'll see, go to Thailand. It's a long story, but let's go to Thailand. I said, I think I'm going to go to Tijuana. And it was a 4-day trip, a 5-day trip. And long story short, I mean, I went back and forth a little bit, but I just kind of stayed. And so I got down to Tijuana, and it changed a lot over the last almost 7, 8 years now. So it's been 5 lifetimes of stories of the ebbs and flows. But I got down here and there was a lot of volunteers, but there was not a lot of US attorneys in Tijuana. And there was a huge need. And there was just at the time, which actually is prescient to talk about today, but at the time there was a system in place called metering. You went and got a number. The US government would let in a certain number of people a day. And so I started working with an organization called Otro Lado. That was for about a year. By February of 2019, I was living in Tijuana. And, it sounds religious, and I'm not necessarily trying to use it in that connotation, but I really felt like this is what I'm supposed to do right now. So it's a 180-degree turn from public defender I was actually working in the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, and I loved it. But I did just feel somewhat as though this is a skill set that's needed right now. And partially, it really felt as though, and this has happened a couple times in my life, where I don't want the only export of the United States of America being Donald Trump and his policies. I just thought I can be an
Well
American.
said.
I can be an American who believes in something else, fighting for what I believe. And this is the place that I have a skill set. I can do it right now. So the plan was I subletted my apartment, and I was going to stay for 3 months, and that turned into stay. At the end of that, it was more like 9 months. A group of funders and a group of LGBT organizations received some funding to start a pilot project also in Tijuana. And I got the really grateful, privileged opportunity to start a legal project in Tijuana specifically for LGBT folks. So that is how that launched. And I think at the time I thought, well, I'm going to spend 6 months. What an amazing opportunity. And set this up, and it'll be something really important in my career to be able to do that. And then I'll go home. And, here we are. Home is where you hang your hat. And I am now very firmly.
You're definitely into 8 years now.
Yeah.
And just that moment when you were there, what a time to have been working with Otro Lado, when that was one of the only caravans, actually. Trump made so much noise about caravans, and Fox News, it was on all the time. This is pretty much the only one that really made it all the way to Tijuana in significant numbers, mostly people from Central America, as I remember. You were there for that. You were there for metering, and Tijuana was one of the places where the so-called list, the waiting list, was enormously famous and well-known. People had to sign onto this list managed by the migrants for appointments at the port of entry. And I guess by the time that grant came around, Remain in Mexico had started in a big way, had really been ramped up by mid to late 2019. So what a moment. And then, of course, pandemic 6 months after that. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. I mean, I liken some of that. I mean, I will asterisk a little bit, which is, I think that the list, the quote unquote list, was this notebook from an OXXO, which is like a 7-Eleven. And who controlled this list? So migrant, the government would say asylum seekers controlled this list. So when you'd go, there was like a little tarp, and asylum seekers would be writing the names. It was just a name. You got this little piece of paper. I'm really happy. I have a little paper of how these things got written down. You just get a little notebook paper ripped off. Yeah. It's 1,222 or whatever. But INM, which is Mexican migration, would hold the list overnight for safekeeping. Mm-hmm. And you really talk to Mexican migration, they would say that CBP would call them every day and tell them how many numbers to call. So who controlled the list will forever be a source of contention. Yeah, but so metering was taking place. That seemed really hard in a lot of ways. And obviously across the ports of entry, everyone over time had a metering list. And every port of entry has very different conditions and circumstances. But yeah, then you had MPP. So people would get their number called. They would walk across off with their hopes and dreams, and their number was when they called. And by nighttime, they'd be back with papers to go to court. So actually, Otro Lado at the time kind of bifurcated. We had a clinic on the 3rd floor that was for you're trying to get to the United States, and we had a clinic up on the roof we had to just feastily create for people coming back. And the third country transit ban maybe came into effect. So it was just kind of like when I don't know if any of you have ever been in the sea and the wave hits and you can't quite so you get your head up enough to get a breath, but you see the next wave. And then there was any number of things through that whole year. I mean, it was just every little bit.
And that was concurrent with Title 42. Yeah.
And then, so then the project that I started for LGBT asylum seekers was in October of 2019. And that was also just kind of getting that started and lessons learned there. As we had 6 months to prove, kind of try and establish what we were doing. We had 6 months of funding. So I felt a lot of pressure, but I remember 17 people crossed in the first week. So
Wow.
before we even, like, I had a little plastic box from Staples on my apartment floor, and all of a sudden I had 17 files in it, and so then you're just trying to
Wow.
build and do, and so, yeah, we really operated on both sides of the border. And then obviously by March of the following year, the border was closed because of COVID.
Mhm.
All that was also not that simple. It's not for a long time.
And in both of these cases, a lot of your clients, the people you're working with, whether it's MPP or Title 42, you've got people just stuck in Tijuana, not intending to settle there. And if they are LGBT, especially I know there are a couple of shelters in Tijuana, almost unique along the border, that have existed particularly for trans migrants, but also for gay and lesbian migrants or bisexual. And what was Tijuana an okay place? I'm not going to phrase this well, but yeah,
No.
obviously compared to the rest of the border, it was probably better. But I mean, what were the challenges people were facing and continue to face as they're stuck there?
Yeah. I mean, I think a good story. I would say Tijuana is unique. I think that's fair. It's a specific word, but I think it almost is unique among. There has been a few other LGBT shelters. There was briefly one in Matamoros. There
Oh, I
was
didn't know that.
kinda one in Juarez
Yeah.
a couple times, actually. There was actually a very interesting, like, as a project, migrant-led trans shelter in Juarez for a little while. But, in terms of infrastructure, yeah, Tijuana. So if you look at a map of Mexico, not to digress, but if you're pretty much anywhere in Mexico, the straightest shot, if you're trying to get to the United States, is not through Tijuana. Tijuana requires a real serious left turn.
Oh, South Texas is like way
Yeah.
closer.
And that left turn involves crossing a couple different cartels. So,
Mm,
it's not the easiest place to get. But that said, Mexico, for that reason, Tijuana, I think still, but historically, has a larger population of Mexican nationals who would be coming where it is a little bit more of a straight shot. So Michoacan, some of those areas that are pretty heavily hit, and there's a
yeah,
lot of
that's interesting.
internally displaced people. Yeah. So there's a lot more Mexicans. This is also true, I'd say, for Nogales randomly, but there are a couple LGBT shelters here. Those are also pretty new. So when I got Tijuana in 2018, there were not LGBT shelters. There was one, I'm sorry. There was an LGBT center that was more like a rehabilitation center. Tijuana has a lot of rehabilitation centers for drug and
Yeah.
alcohol use, but it really would also take in migrants. So there was one. I don't want to leave somebody out. I'll get a call after this, but it was kind of triaging it, I would say. Around the time of that large caravan, two other shelters started up, and there definitely was a need. I mean, a lot of the shelters historically and still to this day along the US Mexico border are Catholic. People have
Right.
various experiences. I've had clients have to cut their hair or just hide.
Wow.
There was an incident, and the reason I bring that up about timing is that I want to say it was in early 2018. I think it was a LGBT caravan had come to Tijuana, and they were staying either in a shelter or in a hotel, and someone put a burning mattress against the wall, and they all had to kind of try and get out of it. So because of that, I might be telling the story wrong, but I'm either combining two stories. All of the facts are true, but I believe a lot of them went to Nogales and crossed to Nogales, which is in Arizona, Sonora. So yeah, in our very recent history, it was difficult, and you get an hour outside of Tijuana, or you talk to people about their daily life when they leave the shelter. And so just because there is a shelter, you kind of have to remember, well, that is not nothing. That's actually huge, but it doesn't really
Mhm.
solve the issue migrants are having. We went to Sonora a couple of years ago. This was during CBP One, so probably 2024. And we went to Hermosillo, which is about an hour and a half south of Nogales, depending on how fast you drive. And there was a bus stop. There was nothing there. There were no lawyers. There were no even Mexican attorneys doing this work. There were no shelters. There was no
No
infrastructure.
shelters.
There was an INM shelter. They call it a shelter. And they let me in for a minute. There were people staying
Mhm.
there, but it was kind of hard to tell. It was a little dubious, but they called it a shelter, but it couldn't house everyone. And what we learned there was we were there because someone had called us and said, please come. There was a bus company that was selling tickets to mostly African migrants. The last bus a day would get in about 3 a.m., and they would just have to sleep in a field across the street from this bus. And the next morning,
Wow.
cartels would come and say, we'll help you get to Tijuana. And obviously, they weren't going to Tijuana. They would get them right. So there was a whole lot of people crossing right in a place called Ajo, Arizona. And the
It
reason
was
for that
actually
is
made
not
some
random.
headlines, yeah, around
Yeah,
early
it pretty much
2024.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the next
Mm.
day we went up there and there was a lot of people crossing. But the reason they were crossing is the cartels basically got them off the trucks at that spot and said, you pay us or we'll kidnap you, but we're not going to cross you to Baja California, which takes you out of our money
Yeah, too
sphere.
far.
So,
Yeah.
but I remember sitting in this field thinking it's 113 degrees Fahrenheit and none of you speaks a language CBP. And we'll talk about what
Mhm.
CBP One is if it's relevant, but it was the way to cross at the time. The application you would use that was available in English, Spanish, and maybe French,
Maybe
maybe
Creole after time. Yeah.
Creole. It was Creole.
Yeah.
And I remember just thinking, I had another lawyer with me at the time, and we were like, there is no point in going. I mean, we did go talk to people, but how do you say, oh, you're going to have to sit here and apply each day for 6 months. And the app is in a language they don't speak, and they don't have songs that are Mexican. It was just a farce. So within those groups of people too, like no one's going to say, oh, I'm LGBT. So that's my last point I'll make on
Right.
this is that you also see a lot of diversity of experience between people who have to choose between staying within a language and cultural group they feel most comfortable and safe and being
Mm.
out. So if you are from Mauritania and you don't speak Spanish and you are not Mexican or a Latin American country, you are not necessarily going to say, oh, I'm fleeing because I'm a lesbian.
Right.
You're going to try and stay within that group. So those people also historically, even Jamaicans who do speak English, have historically had more difficulty finding safety and security within those shelters that the very few that do exist. So that's another kind of distinction to make is within, indigenous communities, Black communities, certainly, who kind of are still really on the fringes of the very little infrastructure that exists.
Yeah. The trip is that much more dangerous.
Yeah, for sure.
When you get to Tijuana, is Tijuana at least, I mean, the threats are everywhere. You've already mentioned the burning a mattress, but there are more spaces, at least.
Yeah.
Somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like each of these places hold 30 people. I mean, they can cram
Yeah.
people in, but when you consider a whole huge border and a huge country, and I'm sure this is covered on your podcast too, but, so actually on the flip side is a lot of, for example, Russians and Ukrainians, they would have come to cross through Tijuana. And that's because the places they're getting their information are not necessarily, this is something the Biden administration did do is they at least tried to tackle some of the misinformation because
Right.
the groups you're getting, and I'll talk to people, I'll be like, where did you hear that? They, oh, my Telegram group. Well,
Yeah.
why wouldn't you listen to that group? I mean, in your language, it's people explaining things, everyone's saying yes. But anyway, you have to know to get to Tijuana. And so there's certainly some word of mouth that gets you there, but a lot of people end up all over the place for all kinds of reasons.
And to get there, I mean, as you said, it's the furthest. You're having to cross through a patchwork of territory controlled by criminal groups. That's just for the audience. When you say the cartel, like is, saying, I'll take you to Arizona or something.
Right.
Are we talking about Chapo Guzman and the Sinaloa cartel? Or are we talking about sort of mom and pop coyote bosses who maybe pay a toll to the larger groups?
Yeah, I guess it depends on where you are.
It does.
But yeah, I mean, I guess the best way to say it is if you think of Mexico, there's a patchwork of, I mean, actually and I'm gonna really dumb this. Because
That's what we have to do.
just in case anyone's listening thinking that's wrong. I know. Think of it as a map, and there's states and different areas are controlled by different cartels, which you would say are more organized. There are places, Tijuana being one of them, where there is a lot more, I would say, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood fights for control. Tijuana certainly being one of those places, which can increase. Sonora, for example, being a lot more stably controlled by a cartel. Historically, and now that I live here, the history of crossing the border was drastically changed by 9/11. So you will talk to people who've lived in Tijuana their whole lives. They'll go, oh yeah, that neighborhood over there, and they used to be called like polleros, which is like chicken
herders, sort of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so like, and they just would help people get across. It's a family business. And think what you will about all of that. But, I mean, you hear people talk about the 90s, the 80s, and, people either just crossed or.
It was described as mom and pop. Yeah.
It was, I think, a lot more like, oh, that's a family business. It was for profit, but it certainly by the mid 2000s, I would say, became much more a money-making business of cartels seeking to make money. So people are trafficked. I would start using the word trafficking, and it looks very different for different nationalities is something I've learned. You are from an Eastern European country, the trafficking, the prices, where you're going to cross, all
Hmm.
changes. The amount you pay, even if you're talking about someone putting a ladder up on the wall, it's if you're Honduran versus this versus that. Obviously, corruption's really rampant. And so it looks a lot of different ways that it's impossible to cover. But yeah, I think, but at its most basic, if you are in Tapachula, Mexico, which is in the very south of Mexico, you are navigating your everyday criminal kind of gang, kind of just criminal activity. If you ride a train or you're on a bus, you're also dealing with government corruption. And then you're dealing with what I would call more organized cartels that can also have as much power as certainly a government official to tell you where you're going, take all your money. Certainly, again, just an extra vulnerability if you appear. Yeah, and I distinguish, like you say, LGB, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, which is more
Hmm.
sexual orientation, which can look very obvious or not at all,
Hmm.
or transgender or gender nonconforming, gender diverse, where your gender does not comport with what one would think you should look like based on the sex assigned at birth, So you're trying to cross, there's this little area in San Luis Potosí, which is a little north of Mexico City. There's this like either bridge or river you cross. Everyone knows you pay there. But if you're transgender, you go through different, you just have a much higher risk
Even there,
potential.
wow.
Yeah. So, you deal with that every step of the way as you're trying to traverse a very large country.
So you're risking extra attack. I mean, so yeah, you could see people
Yeah.
hiding their identity as much as possible all along the way. I had
Yeah.
not heard about LGBTQ caravans, like people traveling together for safety in numbers, but
Yeah.
makes all the
And
sense in
even
the world.
even within the larger caravan, like they were political on all ends, right? So there's
Mm.
always been this Christmas caravan, but it didn't necessarily get anywhere, but it was
The
designed to be
Easter
around
too. Yeah.
Christmas because of the Easter story. And so those were very
Mhm.
religious in nature. Probably not highlighting LGBT folks, but then if you have a 200-person caravan, you're going to have 20 within that may be grouped
Sure.
together and say, I'll
Okay.
stay awake while you sleep, or we'll band together and pool our money to get
Um,
food, or,
yeah.
there's caravans within caravans. I'm sure LGBT people are not the only ones, but if you're traveling, if you're Honduran fleeing Honduras and you're trans, you might experience much of the same type of treatment you experienced in Honduras. So if there's three other
Right.
people you can travel with and try and stay a little safer, you might do that, or you might splinter off. So that's another thing we would do is there's groups of people, we'd leave Tijuana and then we'd have a couple splinters saying, yeah, we couldn't stay with the larger group. So that's what I mean by LGBT caravan is I hate to
Mhm.
use the word caravan in a way because it's taken on such a,
No, but it's using the shorthand for
yeah,
migrating to achieve safety in numbers without having to pay exorbitant fees to a smuggler. Like that was
take
the goal.
take back the word. It's a group of people traveling. Think of it in the English context.
This is a dumb question. This is a dumb question, perhaps, but for those who could pay exorbitant fees, or even partially, were there smugglers who were considered more trustworthy or who could even specialize in taking LGBT migrants? Or is that just a silly thing to even think of?
Well, I can't answer the question for LGBT people specifically. And I will say, partially because of where I work, I know what I know because I talk to clients and I also try and remain blissfully ignorant. I just feel like, sometimes people come and ask me and I'm like, I live here, so I know things. I would say as a general whole, and I think this is I will broaden the point a bit, which I think is important, which is that if you have money, there's always a way
Yeah.
and there's safer ways. And I think no matter how big of a wall you build, and then this is one of my bigger points I always make specifically around LGBT migration in general is the push by Western countries, and my specialty or my country of origin obviously is the United States. That's where I work. The more we try and push the borders, invisible borders of migration outward and make it harder and harder, if you have someone who has a lot of money and ill intent, they will probably be able to pay to figure it out. But hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people suffer the effects. No one's screening 100 miles from the border for, oh, you're trans. We should get you
Mm.
as quickly as possible to safety in the United States. The tools become very blunt instruments. And so the victims of those instruments tend to be those who are most vulnerable.
Right.
And so, yeah, probably. I mean, my answer is commonsensically, I would assume so. If you have a lot of money and you have good connections, I'm sure
No, I mean,
So
and the money, it's not just that the smuggler puts it all in their pocket. It gets spread along state officials all along the way to make the journey less dangerous.
including
To get,
U.S. including
yeah,
U.S.
got to get
officials.
waved through those
Yeah.
checkpoints. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about the challenges faced once they actually make it to the U.S. border and have an interaction with U.S. officials. Maybe just before we do that, though, I'm talking to people in shelters and people who represent migrants who often do work on the Mexican side. I mean, everybody has noticed an uptick really since the late 2010s in the number who are kidnapped, the number who, actually making it all the way to a Mexican border city without having been kidnapped, without having been really badly shaken down or extorted, either in the Darien Gap, but especially in Mexico, has become ever less common. Certainly, that's even a bigger issue, probably in places like Tamaulipas, the eastern part of the border. I have to imagine that the risk or the likelihood of that happening to you multiplies if you are LGBT or really from any more vulnerable group
I think exponentially. I sometimes,
exponentially.
so yeah, I think about it a lot. I think especially when MPP was in place in Title 42, there was this time period, and it was during the Biden administration. But at the time, it's been somewhat resolved. But I had a large group of Jamaicans. I don't remember how many. I'm not saying large, like, I don't know, 20, 30, who,
That's big.
you bottle up over years, right? People are getting there and there's nowhere to go. So, but, a number of them couldn't access HIV medication in Mexico. And so I'm just sitting there thinking, well, there's got to be, like, I just need to have the right meeting with the right person and someone, even if it's just I write a request and I could get someone through as an exception to the closing of the border. And just over time, there was none and none and none. And I just saw people getting sicker and sicker, and I'm thinking, really thinking back to my elders within the LGBT movement, talking about living through AIDS and HIV and AIDS crisis before there were antiretrovirals. Like, as I grew up, it was a treatable, chronic, but treatable.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought someone's going to die, and how is this possible? But certainly MPP, which is the Migrant Protection Protocols that remain in Mexico, same thing, where you talk to people and what they went through in their own country was certainly persecution. But whatever they went through trying to get from where they left to the United States was equally horrific
Yeah.
and so preventable. So preventable, especially when you start talking about you cross people, they're returned to Mexico, at which point they're kidnapped, sexually assaulted, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an act by the United States government to say, oh, you're safe, go away to Mexico. So yeah, no, for sure. I would say any migrants at risk, but certainly transgender people and LGBT folks, just all the more just there.
hung out there with invulnerability.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, you get to the United States, let's say during the Biden years. So before all these new restrictions and immigration court precedents have come up, your choice is to try to evade capture or, of course, to try your luck in the U.S. asylum system where, people like you to offer advice and help. What was that like? You have your first interaction with a CBP officer or a border patrol agent. I want to ask for protection. I am a member of a particular social group. Probably people weren't using the terminology, but that was implied.
Unless they met with me, no.
Right.
They were, even if they did, they were not.
But yeah, how did that work, and how often could somebody actually expect, or how likely was it that someone could expect getting some protected status in the United States?
That's a great question. I will say, and it's a big question. I will say this, just as a general point, before I specifically worked in this role, I've had a couple now, but that specifically works around LGBT migration, specifically from a little bit more than just a US lens. I was shocked at how many people I would meet in Mexico who are returning a second time with some sort of removal order. I think there's a general, I think within the LGBT community too, I think even within immigration lawyer community, there's a sense that if you make it and you get in the immigration system, how are you going to lose your case?
Mhm.
And I was surprised. I'm not surprised anymore, but I certainly was at the amount and the why, just kind of learning why that happened. So I will start there. It kind of turns into like,
Maybe you get a bad judge,
if you had access to counsel, and if a couple
Right.
ifs. Also, I think a lot of people cross to the United States with so much. So, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that you have to apply for asylum within a year of entering the
Within a
United
year.
States. Now, this seems like, I think if I was not an immigration person, I would go, well, how hard is that? You get to the United States, you apply. If I go to Mexico, I apply for my visa, you know? So I think on the surface, it seems not weird. But let's say you come on a visitor visa, or let's say you come and someone hands you papers and you have parole. Let's say
Hmm.
you came to the United States and are immediately inundated. We're one of the few countries that don't automatically give work permit, for example. So
Right.
you're immediately, and a lot of people who are LGBT don't have a supportive family unit. They don't necessarily have family to go to.
Right.
Some do,
Right.
but a lot don't. So it's a little bit harder to get a job, maybe. So many things can happen, and that's if you understood the idea you have to apply within a year. Like, a lot of people just think, well,
Right.
I'm here now. I don't know what to do, but I'm here. And the trauma responses of just trying to survive really can. So I
Yeah.
would say
Yeah.
that, but it really runs a spectrum. I mean, during Biden, I think there was certainly an attempt to regularize and allow people to enter a certain way. When Biden came into office with the border closure because of COVID, which was really based on a public health law that Stephen
Right.
Miller pulled out of his very deep pockets of ideas. And so, and I can't speak for them and wouldn't, but like, I think there was a sense of, how do we wind this down? And because it's nonsensical, like visas are crossing, US citizens are crossing in and out. Yeah, I think it's important also to just say that LGBT people come to the United States in all kinds of ways. So that's something I think affecting LGBT migration now is certain country bans and visa bans. And so the southern US border is not the only way in which LGBT people obviously seek
Sure.
protection, or just try and get out of where they are so they can find protection, right? But anyway, entering the US, yeah, I mean, it runs a spectrum of experiences. I think during certain times and places, I think crossing outside of ports of entry means you're dealing with whatever CBP officer pulls you over. I would say that almost everybody I've encountered overwhelmingly doesn't want to cross and run for it, or whatever the right way to put it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even with all the words people use, we just have so for decades lost the narrative war, which is really vital. You know, we even got a call once and we didn't know they were crossing beforehand, but they crossed somewhere in Arizona. They called us and they said, we borrowed someone's phone on the side of the road and we've seen two different CBP trucks and they're filled with people and they just told us to keep walking. Like, we want to get stopped by CBP. I think that's all.
They're
Yeah,
waiting to
you
be
know?
picked up. Yeah.
Yeah.
That, you know, that option doesn't exist right now. And the number of people who Border Patrol is finding is super low right now. It shows you that most people actually did want to turn themselves in.
Most
Yeah.
people are just trying to do their thing in the quote unquote right way, which is another overly used term areas. But yeah, well, and say like the numbers aren't perfect. I think the numbers are a drastic undercount, and we haven't had good numbers even tried to be done by those who study these things. But the guesstimate of around 2020-ish was that there's about 1.5 million LGBT immigrants, you know, in the United States,
Wow.
which is about 3%-ish of the number. Again, I want to say, I think that number is probably way less than the reality. So it's about 3%. And around 20% of those people are undocumented, which is also a tricky word. Is an asylum seeker undocumented, or, you know, what there's undocumented, like I have no protection pending, I have no papers, I'm just here. And then there's, I have TPS or I have something else, which is a liminal, I call it a liminal state of status. No. It's neither permanent nor really temporary. It's just, you are known. So yeah, I think most people try and make their way through the courts. They try and find a way in which they can stay in the United States, and whatever that looks like.
And that was becoming, it was becoming easier to do. Not easier, but it was becoming, you had a better success rate. I think you were winning more cases. And then the new administration put in place a bunch of things that probably a lot of our listeners haven't quite heard about. Not the big famous
Yeah.
things like just simply banning asylum, but yeah, other
Yeah.
moves.
So I think, you know, again, I want to draw us back a little bit. And I'll just take it to when I got here. What we thought was bad in 2018
Mm,
was metering, meaning you get to present at a port of entry and you get to seek asylum, but you have to wait. And those waits, depending on where, could be dangerous and could be long. And that was considered illegal. I still think it is, especially if you're a
mhm.
Mexican having to sit and wait.
Yeah, we should just mention to our listeners that
Yeah.
the very morning that we're recording,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court upheld the practice of metering even after it was overturned at every lower court level.
Yes, the Supreme Court is a court that doesn't have to take cases. They very much chose to take
Mhm. Mhm.
that case actually on a, not a technicality, but on a procedural, for a procedural reason, really had no reason to go to the Supreme Court. So they obviously wanted the case. They chose to take it, spend their
There was
time.
an agenda there.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, I think going back to 2018, you just started to see this erosion and of, and I really would say this is across the spectrum. So I think Biden wanted, I'm not going to channel Biden's thoughts, but I think, let's say Democrat, Republican. Republicans are on a spectrum. Some of them are like, I want to close the border, no asylum. Others say, let's get rid of everybody for reasons
Right.
that, I don't have strong feelings for. This is not America, whatever. And then
Yeah.
on the Democratic side, you don't see a robust response, really. You don't see a defense of why, and one of the reasons we have some of these protections is because, and this is something that I think everyone should know and read about is, and it's not the only example, but pre-World War II, there was one ship in particular, but there was a lot of examples of Jewish refugees from Europe trying to enter the United States. And there's one very famous example called the U.S. St. Louis
Mhm.
that tried to
Okay.
dock in New York. And there's actually narratives of people, the few people who survived, saying, I remember seeing the United States. I remember seeing the Statue of Liberty and thinking, we've made it. We're free. We're going to be safe. And that ship was turned around, briefly docked, I think, in Cuba, and was eventually returned to Europe. And almost everyone on that ship
Most of
was
it.
killed.
Right.
It was not the only example, but it's one that's been discussed a lot. And in the wake of World War II, you have a lot of displaced folks. And there was a thought of, this can't happen again this way.
Right.
Like if you are fleeing a country, you should be able to seek safety. Now that country gets to decide how that happens. That country
Mhm.
gets to decide the procedures that are in place. You get to adjudicate who they are. You don't have to take them forever, but you can't turn them away like that. And that was really the sad part is, if you listen to the oral argument, which I gutted myself through, is it's just 9 people just parsing apart a word. And that's what lawyers
Trying to
do.
decide what the word "in"
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I mean, that is what lawyers do. That's certainly what I do. But I mean, when you really think about what they're talking about, which is not just people, but also what values, morals, how we want our laws to be implemented. It's really about that USS Lewis, and that ship should have landed and those people and their descendants should have lived. During the Biden
Yeah.
administration, it was not easy. I mean, they were implementing a lot of rules as well. They externalized. I think they just wanted a process. They wanted it to be quote unquote humane, however they defined that. So it was difficult. January 2025, it was a Monday. January 20th, 2025 was a Monday. I came down to our office in Tijuana and I sat down about 9. And by 9:30, we had gotten some calls from people where they had appointments to cross the border. They had waited 6, 7 months, and those appointments had been canceled. So that, I mean, I already knew obviously everything was going to change, but that was kind of the first in the stomach feeling of, okay, so
Ugh.
that's done, and people who I had met with who had waited and waited and waited and waited and could have gone and jumped over a wall said, no,
Mhm.
I'm going to do this the way I'm supposed to do it. And that ended. And I guess in the year and a half, the very,
You,
very
you had
long,
clients whose appointments were canceled.
yeah, they just got this notification, this is done. So, it wasn't just they were waiting for an appointment, they had an appointment. And even I saw this horrific picture, or tragic, I don't know the right adjective, but this woman just with anguish on her face, and she was actually standing at the port in Juarez for a
Yeah.
1:00 appointment, and that photo really tells the 1,000 words that just you imagine what they had gone through to wait and to get to that spot, and they were standing there.
Oops,
So
sorry.
overnight, the system that had been in place since May of 2023 ended. So that was the first kind of like, all right. And I think it's important, again, I feel like I keep digressing, but bringing it back a little bit to LGBT folks is we had just gone through an election cycle where it was the other and the us. And the us
Yeah.
are the mega people, a certain sense of what is American, I guess, which is really
Absolutely.
located
Who belongs?
in who belongs. And who belongs, I guess, if you're JD Vance, is the Civil War, because that's when his family got here. Certainly white. It's based on a who and a what rather than ideas, right? A lot of us would say the United States, for all of its faults, again, different podcasts, but
Yeah.
is based on a concept. It's based on laws. It's based on regularity. So maybe you wind down a program, but you don't end it, let's say. But anyway,
Mhm.
so the other
Mhm.
piece of that in terms of my work was I spent the whole year before the election watching that Kamala, they, them commercial, right?
Yes.
I can't remember. It's like work
Kamala
for
is for
you.
they, them, not for
Yeah.
you, blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah. Something like that, and it always it just give you the kind of heebie-jeebies
It really
listening
did.
to it. And, and I know Democrats like to blame Democrats for all that, but, I like to say, I don't remember Kamala saying anything at all at any point of her very short run about transgender people or saying no or
I don't
pushing
either.
back. So, I don't know if that's why she lost the election. They were running from it as quickly as they were trying to run from immigration. But the problem is when you create a space, that space is filled, right? And so, anyway, again, kind of a digression, but what we saw on the very first day was not only a slew of executive orders around immigration, but also a number of executive orders around what they perceive as anti-transgender. So I think the one was like defending women from gender ideology, extremism, restoring biological truth to federal government. So that really left us thinking, okay, so you have two groups that are really the targets that are kind of outside that are now going to be attacked. And it's immigrants, it's trans people, at least in also
Checking all
leftists. And
boxes.
there's not,
Yeah.
you figure my clients are both.
Yeah.
So what is that going to look like? And, you've seen maybe less than I would think. And in some ways, what they've done in a year and a half has been way more. So kind of locating now, what did we start to see going into it on January 20th was you just immediately, I remember just feeling like, oh man. And then I went to cross the border back because I was crossing back that night and I had my son in the car. And as I got close to the border, I started thinking like, I wonder if they know who I am. I mean, not to be arrogant or anything, but I'm like, I'm an immigration lawyer working
You're
transgender
locally
women.
known.
But I was like, you just have this moment of realizing like the government's changed, I guess. Is my point. So the Trump administration has done everything they can to eliminate pathways to protection for everybody. What we started to see was, I'll just like speak specifically for people in court. So asylum seekers going to court. Before Trump was in office, I would say 80 to 90% of people went to their asylum hearing. People went to court. And yes, it took a long
they
time.
wanted to be there. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that is their ticket to figuring out if they can stay or not. And largely, although it was not a rule, there were not huge numbers of transgender people in immigration detention. I don't want to say none, but there
Right,
was
but
certainly
it was
less.
unusual.
Yeah. And so what we started to see in courts was you started seeing the courthouse arrests, which a lot of people know of. So you go in with your clients, the government says, we want to dismiss this case, which they have every right to do. We're going to exercise our discretion to dismiss this case. Well, now the person has no case. They walk out the doors, they get arrested. We had a client get arrested for something silly at a birthday party. It was his birthday party, unfortunately, in Utah, and they dismissed his case. He was then placed as though he had just entered. So he'd already entered, he'd gotten a work permit, he'd done everything he was supposed to do, he applied for asylum, but he got arrested, they dismissed his case, and then they send him back to the beginning process where he has to go through an interview. So he has that credible fear interview. He has that interview. You saw USCIS, which is the other agency, the main agency you can apply for asylum, just going through and dismissing a lot of cases or referring a lot of cases. You saw as the year progressed, there's a thing called pretermission, which is there's 3 different reasons, but what they're doing is they go through and they say, well, if application isn't filled out enough, which if you think people are trying to fill out applications from detention in a language they don't speak and they're not attorneys, they don't fill it out correctly. Historically, a judge might say, well, let's fill it out or let's get to the heart of the matter. This case,
No, I've heard nightmare cases where people confuse month and day on the date. That's it. That's all it takes.
Yeah. Or just, an inconsistency or substantive inconsistency. Another thing that started to happen along the lines of pretermission is just judges could go through asylum applications and say, well, this isn't filled out enough to make out a case, which is very subjective in my opinion. But I would say historically as well, I think the practice of even a lot of attorneys, myself included, is you fill out an application enough to state a claim, but you leave open, like you meet this person once and you go through and fill out their application. You don't want to put something down or write something wrong. So, that's just not how it works previously. And then the third type of pretermission was, and I think this
one's incredible.
Something that is huge is we have 2 ways in which it's called the asylum cooperative agreements. So the U.S. is going around to small countries that we can buy basically and saying, sign an agreement with us that you'll take asylum seekers. And then we are not breaking the international law that we can't turn away asylum seekers. We're basically just transferring them to another country which agrees to take them.
You're going to Honduras and you're going to go into the
Right.
Honduran asylum system, or Ecuador, or
Right.
Jamaica, Belize, Paraguay.
Such as that asylum seeking system is. This is not new. I mean, these have been around a while, but
The administration stopped them. But yeah,
it's been written into the law for a while. And Trump certainly tried this. I mean, during the first Trump administration, I had a client who she got deported and then was come back, got stuck under Title 42, had all kinds of horrible stuff happen when she was returned to Honduras. And we finally got her records, and I realized what had happened was she crossed into Texas, got a review to go to Guatemala. So this was during the first Trump administration. We had this thing with Guatemala called GACA, the Guatemala Asylum Cooperative Agreement. And in the interview, you read the transcript, it says, "I'm transgender. I am scared to go to Guatemala." Why are you scared? Well, I went there and people said horrible things to me and it's unsafe and dangerous and I don't want to go there. Found credible, found amenable to resettlement in Guatemala. So she got sent to Guatemala. These exist, they'd existed, but they started doing them. I would sit in court and there'd be maybe 40 people in there and the department would just be filing them for all but 2 people who
so a country that is taking like 50 people a month tops, like Ecuador, they would put like hundreds or even thousands of people on the list to go to Ecuador as a way to close their cases.
So you're given an order of removal for the United States. No one's listened to your asylum case. And they just say, well, go to Ecuador, go to Honduras. And,
They're full.
Yeah. And then Ecuador says, well, we don't really want anybody. But the other thing about this is that, the ACAs are a little different, but once they're off U.S. soil and we can say, we've had diplomatic assurances, blah, 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 blah. We really don't care what happens. So, I mean, there's no way these countries are necessarily keeping them. They don't have asylum systems to really do it. So anyway, that started to happen en masse and it was really traumatic. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know how else to say it. You just sit in court and you just see a bunch of people confused, like, I have no idea what's happening. There's thousands and thousands of these hanging there. And you start to think, like, I don't even know if I can keep doing this. All of these things are happening. While I would say those are some of I'm missing stuff, but this is just in asylum. This is just removal court. The other thing that's happening is they're gutting the court. So when you say court and you say immigration judge, you're actually talking about an administrative agency within the Department of Justice. So in other words, every immigration judge's boss is, I guess at this point, Blanche.
The Attorney General.
It is not, or before that, Pam Bondi.
Not a separate branch of government.
Not a separate, not an impartial branch of the government. And even the immigration judges union has said, there's solid reasons to get this out of that. But what it means is they can wave a wand much quicker and say, we're done. So over the past year, they have eliminated entirely the San Francisco Immigration Court. They have fired without cause upwards of, I think, 150 judges.
Yeah,
They have
about a quarter.
about a quarter of, I think there was a total rough numbers with 700 immigration judges. They replaced them with about 100, maybe about the same number of new judges, relabeled deportation judges.
Yes.
The training program that existed is truncated. You can imagine. I mean, if you go you can Google it, the job advertisement, and it basically says, do you want to deport people? Signing bonus, sign up. And so that's who's applying and who's getting these jobs. So obviously, even if you manage to make it through the gauntlet of substantive things that are a mix of substantive and procedural changes and manage to get yourself in and out of court, you can imagine the number of people who just didn't go to court.
Right.
You can't say it's not rational in some ways. Your chances of winning an immigration court have substantially narrowed, obviously. And then I guess briefly, that's just immigration court. We also today saw the Supreme Court say that the executive branch can just end what's called temporary protected status. So I think there's 17 countries right now that have temporary protected status, which gives you a year to a year and a half that's renewable if a country is unsafe in some way. And some people have been here upwards of 20 years under TPS from certain countries. But so that is going to be the largest delegalization anywhere ever of, I think, upwards of 1.5 to 2 million people.
That's right.
And that is not, according to the Supreme Court, as of this morning, not reviewable by a judge. So you look at Haiti being the example that was in front of the court. You have Trump calling them shithole countries and really racist, vile
On the
things
record over and over
all
with
over the
Trump.
place.
And
There
Christy
was
Noem really not
no
even pretending to have gone through a process.
there was no
Yeah.
process to say, is Haiti safe? And they are now saying that whatever process the executive branch goes through, we take on faith and no judge can review it. Every single lower court before the Supreme Court had said, no, that's not what the statute says. So there's that, which is going to be huge. People who have DACA, which is deferred action for childhood arrivals, we see processing delays. And essentially, if that expires before it's renewed, you have no status in the United States. So you have kids who've been here, not kids, they're 40s, 30s, 40s, who've been with that status for decades at this point, waiting for Congress. It's not that they're ending DACA, but they are in the sense that they're just sitting on the applications. So there's that. I mean, there's just really limiting people's ability to live life, get bank accounts, get work permit. So it's kind of death by a thousand cuts at all angles. I can't think
So
of an
many things that
area.
don't make headlines. So many things that your average
Yeah.
American has no idea about.
So, people who are married to US citizens walking in for their interviews, that really restricting and tightening up green card interviews, denying them more and more. I can't think of an area where they are not leveraging to the maximum legal capacity and in most cases just blowing through the law and figuring it'll take courts a year to catch up. And worst case scenario, you end up with the Supreme Court, which is going to say it's okay. So legal and illegal means in every category. And then, LGBT people are in each of these categories. So there's LGBT Haitians who have TPS. So yeah, nothing's good. Nothing's good, Adam.
Nothing is good.
Nothing is.
I'd like to have you back at time to talk about how eventually to make this better. But I mean, it starts with even what do you do about things like the Supreme Court? Or I guess I would just only ask maybe as a concluding question. I mean, even talking to some people who are aligned with Democrats, there's a feeling like we're not sure if we can save asylum. Is asylum, or at least as we know it, is asylum salvageable without, if you have a future administration that is not undergoing an all-out fight against this protection measure?
In the sense that having watched reality and having watched the narratives that are very powerful, I think the right has very simple problem, solution, evil, easy.
It's on a bumper sticker.
And it's really easy to break stuff apart. So they are just dismantling everything with an unlimited bank account. So, it is, I was even thinking about it this morning when I was driving because all the news was bad about immigration, which was expected. But I mean, there's definitely ways. And I think this is simplistic, but I think that going back to Obama, the Democrats have really seeded narratives. So I think we've tried to come up with bumper stickers like no one's illegal. I don't think that resonates. I agree, but I don't think that resonates. But I think if you sit down, I can just say over the past year, I'm from a really Republican place. And, I would talk to people.
Right?
Yeah, like I talk to people who are like, oh my God, this guy, and he's been a mechanic and he's got 2 kids and he was a soccer coach and they just picked him up. And seeing that is an opportunity. I think the problem is solutions are policy wonky. They take time, they take money, and Congress is unlikely to do anything ever about anything, I think, other than pass spending bills. I think it's difficult, but I think that it starts with remaking narratives. And I think the people who know how to really implement policy, I'm not this person, like how does the government implement a policy, which takes time. I think that has to be a little behind the curtains, but I mean, asylum can't really
at
go
the
away.
community level too.
Yeah. So, I think there actually is a will. I think it's hard to explain what you are going to do as opposed to just saying, oh, but I think people are turning away a bit from what we see. I mean, the amount of people that I have unfortunately had to talk to at barbecues who say, well, they're not going to deport everyone. And I'm like, the sign said mass deportation now.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't hidden. Well, they were going to do the worst of the worst. I'm like, but everyone was trying to get the quote unquote worst of the worst. In 2024, there was around 400,000 people in the United States not in prison who had some form of a conviction. And of those 430,000, I want to say 13,000 were convictions for murder and maybe 19,000 were for serious violent crimes.
Most not violent, yeah.
After that, so that is, I would say to people, I'm like, so I don't think Trump was running an election on, we're going to deport 13,000 plus 20,000. And those people, why are they here? They're here because deportation requires diplomacy, and that requires relationships with
Yeah.
countries that maybe we don't have. No president ever has, Democrat or Republican, has said, "Oh, let's not remove certain people," right? So
Right.
I don't have a formulaic answer to the solutions, but I think we can't decide that it's not salvageable. I all too often am hearing that. I think
Yeah,
we
we
have
cannot
to.
give this up.
I think we kind of have to fight to hold the line, try and prevent bad law, and maybe have a separate subcommittee planning the rebuild. But I think a lot of
Mhm,
that work is
mhm,
around
mhm.
changing the narratives and getting space. This sounds really shallow, but I also think if the economy is running smooth, I think people care less about immigration.
Well, that's true.
And if the Democrat, I think over the past few years, we've just completely feeded the conversation, which just allowed for this idea that Title 42, people were crossing 5, 6 times and being removed. So
Mm.
when we say, oh, there was 10 million people or these crazy numbers, I mean,
Or
that,
the
go
borders were open. Yeah.
stand up and say that's not what happened. But anyway, that's kind of a digression. But I do think it's salvageable. It has to be. I think going back to the earlier discussion around turning away Jewish asylum seekers in World War II, it's not the only example, but there's a reason we have asylum. Forced migration is at an all-time high.
Mhm.
That's not going to go down. Within that, and my particular work, I didn't mention it, but I mean, refugee admissions are at an absolute all-time low. I think 67 countries, 65 countries outlaw being gay in some way. So usually same-sex sexual acts. There's only 37 countries in the world that formally, if you're LGBT. So, you think about some of these countries and the asylum bans and the visa bans and the refugee people who might be more in the refugee category. Like there are LGBT people within that. So, the work is going to continue. The work is going to continue with deported LGBT people who shouldn't have been. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have, I wish I had a great answer. I have a different job, but
Well, no,
definitely the
that's
work
good. I
continues.
mean, you make the good point about narratives and about the local level, about people hearing about this, what's happening
Yeah.
to their neighbors, and that will ultimately form, even if you don't have like a big
Yeah.
policy blueprint, that will give a lot of ability to push back on people who should be our allies or
I
friends
mean,
to the idea of asylum when they go wobbly. So that's
yeah, I
important.
mean, I would encourage people to not just seed the like as though if they mention it, if they mention saying what this is not okay. I think a vast majority of people might be behind that,
Right.
but you have to fill the space, certainly.
Don't cede the space.
Yeah. So that I think narratives, that's not my area, but that's certainly one thing.
Well,
If I
you
have a minute,
contributed wonderfully to it.
if I have 1 minute, I do want to add one other
Absolutely.
thing if I have the time, and that is really around the issue of detention and LGBT folks.
Yes.
I should have probably brought it up sooner, but there's so much funding. It's I think 47 billion, and I'm not caught up on the spending package that passed a few weeks ago.
The
But
45 billion for detention. Yeah.
there's 45 billion for detention, many billions beyond that, most for enforcement. I guess,
Mhm.
yeah. As an amendment to my prior answer, I mean, I'm a big fan of funding procedural systems. I think that there are absolutely very commonsensical, efficient ways to screen and process asylum seekers, give them their day in court, and be way, way less cruel and expensive than this without drastically different numbers of asylum grants. So I
Mhm.
will say that the lawyer hat. But back to detention. Detention is a choice, and specifically immigration detention is a choice. And it's largely governed by money and politics. So political will on the part of whoever's in office and how much money you have to do it. And the first private prison in the United States was in 1983. We are unfortunately not the only countries who do immigration detention, but we certainly exported that. We were the first outside of very specific circumstances. So around Obama, we're talking, so 2008-ish, we're talking 30,000 to 40,000 people a day in immigration detention. By Trump, we're talking 50 to 60. And currently, I think the numbers are somewhere between 60 and 70 fluctuating. But the goal with that 5 billion is 100,000 a day going to private companies largely too. And the effect on LGBT people is, and specifically trans, I think is really worth mentioning. And I, again, wish I'd said it sooner, but this has always been an issue because jails, so immigration detention under our cruel and unusual punishment clause in the Constitution is not punitive, meaning the only reason you are legally allowed to detain Sally, the asylum seeker, is because you think she is not going to come to court or for the safety of the public. So what we have seen in the Trump administration is an effort to legally change the law of who can't get out of detention, who has legal pathways to a bond or parole, but also who has to be detained. So if you make it such that every single immigrant in the United States has to be detained, you are going to have a lot more people throwing their hands up in these places, which are very much not safe, healthy,
Right.
and saying, okay, forget it. Like I'll get out of
my
here.
case.
I'll give up my case. But also your friends are getting billions. But so not only an effort to expand the law of who can get out and who has to be there, but also just this money is designed to double the amount of people in immigration detention every day. And for LGBT people, detention exists really on a binary. You have men facilities and women facilities,
Right.
and trans people don't fall there, and all kinds of people don't, are not safe necessarily. But so this has been an issue going back since immigration prisons began. But, over the past decades, there's been an end trans detention movement led by trans and queer folks saying, like, we want to end trans detention altogether. You saw a huge decrease during the Biden administration.
Right.
Not a rule. It was certainly not none. But there were certain things that came into place. And this was actually 2015. So it was right before the first Trump administration, which is called the Trans Care Memo. It established a committee. It required publishing the numbers of trans people in detention. There were certain detention centers who started getting. It was actually written by Tom Homeless, which is kind of interesting. So if that gives you a sense, it was not the queer activist dream of what could be, but it was something. And so moving into, let's say, the Biden administration, you had 10 detention centers across the United States that had specific language in the contracts around how the treatment of LGBT, but specifically trans folks, would go around hygiene or safety, healthcare, things like that, housing. It was not perfect. I would make a little asterisk that trans men tend to fall outside of some of these things. So they're much more likely to end up in segregated and administrative segregation, which is essentially, which is how you say solitary confinement in immigration speak, because you wouldn't want to say you're punishing somebody. But, so if you're a trans man and they're like, well, we're not going to house you with women because you have facial hair and you're scaring people, I don't know. And you also can't be put with men because they don't want you to get hurt. You're going to end up by yourself. And, there's been cases of people being completely, I have a client right now who's in
the trauma there. My goodness.
Solitary confinement. He has been by himself more than a year. So every day he gets a couple times a day, he can go get food or something. But, so the mental health effects of that, it never was perfect. What we saw in January of 2025, especially because of this executive order, is just an elimination of everything. So it is no longer the case that you can say, I'm trans, I would like to go to one of these 10 places. Or maybe there's a deference to, hey, we can't safely house this person. We're going to release you with an ankle bracelet or some other form of alternative detention. And while they were still required under the law, they hadn't changed the contracts yet. I mean, everything went out the window. So I had a client, for example, who was marked as protective custody, which they said, you're going to be in a bunk room, but you have to sleep on the top bunk. But she had a really bad knee. She couldn't climb the ladder. So she kept sleeping on the bottom bunk, and people would let her sleep on the bottom bunk. So she kept getting written up and yelled at. But she says, but you're not letting me be trans. Like, you won't give me hormones. You won't let me have hair long. You won't let me do any of the things so why am I protective custody? Well, you just are. So in that case, she ended up being put again on her own. So you just saw overnight, basically. And from an advocate perspective, it wasn't ideal. It's not something I'd say, people were jumping up and down about necessarily, but you kind of had a sense of where people were going to go. You kind of knew what courts they were going to be in front of. If you were worried about where someone was going to, if you're trying to find someone, there was an LGBT liaison for LGBT issues. And I used to email them a lot. And I got this email back at the end of January just saying, per executive order, man. So that was done. So, I mean, just efforts to advocate disappeared overnight. Gender affirming care, hormones, so you think about just suddenly overnight having nothing in your body to regulate your the mental health effects and so forth. That went away. It started to just be, you were at any old detention center. So this tended to group you in the South. You have overcrowded conditions. So a lot of people are like, I'm trans, I'm with all the men. I have to use this single toilet, which is kind of a bucket in the corner. Things like that is now the reality for trans.
The showers.
The showers, you have to take a shower just communally with everybody. The food, water, all of that, which everyone deals with, they're dealing with. But if there's any sort of, I've actually heard stories of people trying to protect trans people, just they recognize that it's ridiculous, but you've got a woman sitting in a group with men and a couple people will try and help. And I've also heard the opposite.
Right.
People have issues with guards or anything else. There was a statute called PREA, which still exists, but no longer really being
Prison Rape
enforced around.
Enforcement Act, right?
Yeah. And then, I think as probably a lot more about than me, we used to use, there's certain oversight entities that exist within DHS, which are essentially non-functional. So
There's no one to call for help now. If
there's no one to call.
being-
So, there'll even be numbers on the walls in detention centers. And if you try and call them, it goes to nowhere. And those are the PREA ones in particular. So basically what you see is they are trying to detain everyone they possibly can, irrespective of identity. So more trans people are going to be detained than historical were. They don't care if they're safe. It's absolutely a deterrent. It's absolutely a punishment. All of these companies are private. So you pay someone to do medical care. The least they spend on that medical care, the more you get back.
That's a bad incentive.
They're no longer allowed to provide gender affirming care, nor are there doctors under these contracts who maybe specifically know how to treat transgender people. You have all of that going on, which is obviously a recipe for disaster. You have skyrocketing deaths in detention. You have no oversight. You have no prison visits by anybody. Congress can't even hardly get in. And you have more trans people being rounded up, and they're being housed anywhere and everywhere in overcrowded, horrific conditions. So that is something that I am putting a lot of time into in a new role that I've just recently taken on.
It's a huge scandal. I'm glad you're working on this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm certainly not the first. I'm not the last. I'm not the only, but, certainly I think right now we're just if you're on a scale of red is the worst, we're at the very top of that meter in terms of safety, care, due process rights. You can't actually survive. So there's that. And then you just have a lot of people who, this is slightly separate, but I didn't mention it, which is something that I think is just also really horrific going on right now, which is people who have won withholding. Like I was talking about trans women who didn't apply for asylum within a year, they get withholding. Or if some of the Biden rules meant you weren't eligible for asylum, these people are now getting scooped up and sent to any horrible country Trump can spend $1 million to. So
just for people listening, this is like Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was prohibited from being sent to El Salvador, but they're happy to send him to Liberia.
Yeah. So and so LGBT people are not exempt from those policies. They're not saying, oh, you're trans, because trans does not exist under the current federal government. It does exist, but it's not a thing they can consider. It's harder to win in court, but you also have people who have been walking around the United States for years and years and years with withholding and Convention Against Torture protections or even removal orders. And so when you hear Trump say, oh, there's 1.4 million people who are removable, we need to go get, a lot of those people have withholding. And so you have queer people, trans women, trans men who are looking at, Eswatini or Uganda as potential third country removals. And it's even
specifically have laws prohibiting.
And even more so than the asylum cooperative agreements, those countries are under no requirement. They're required to receive people. When they receive people, they are in a locked hotel, and generally travel arrangements are being made to wherever they were taken. And those are also two huge safety and just, I would say, high on the cruel spectrum that are
going to get killed.
Yeah, particularly targeting and affecting LGBT folks.
I mean, I'm glad that you're working on at least getting the word out about this, because it's a little shocking. I mean, I know the zone is flooded every day. There's something new, but this is getting lost, and I'm glad that some of your work is turning to this. I mean, we'll put on podcasts and we'll do what we can from WOLA as well, but this has to be a bigger issue than it is.
Yeah. I think I think just what you said, it's so hard to understand. Yeah. It's almost like again, I'm North Idaho analogy, but like when you hit hail and you're afraid your windshield's going to break. For anyone who's ever been, it's like, whoa. And so it's like DACA recipient deported erroneously, trans woman gets sent over here. And each thing you think, oh, that's bad. But behind that one story is a policy that's affecting or threatening thousands and thousands of people, with an end goal really of ridding the United States as quickly through legal and illegal means. The idea is to do it quick enough so that you can't catch up. So behind these things are really policies that we can at least try and fight again. Maybe not those individual stories, but I think that's really one of the things that's important.
But people have
they're not unique. They're not unique anecdote like, oh, a mistake was made. They're part of a broader policy.
It's a deliberate effort to determine who doesn't belong here. And yeah,
Right.
people have to know. I think people are getting the sense of it, but people do have to know that this is,
It's overwhelming.
it
That's
is.
just one topic area. Yeah.
It is.
But
I
yeah.
mean, wearing one of my other hats, I work a lot on these boat strikes where they're killing people in the Caribbean and the Pacific. There were several this month. But people who I think would know that this is an issue say to me all the time, those are still happening just because,
Yeah.
it's flooded. People don't know all this other stuff is going on. And that's a big challenge right
Yeah.
now.
I mean, even just a week ago, I think there was a whole effort to deport a whole bunch of Iranians. That was trying
Right.
to
Remember
deport
that? That
them, right.
did
Yeah.
make a lot of news. Like some of them got sent
Yeah.
to the Central African Republic and then,
Yeah.
the next thing happens.
Mhm. So yeah, it's hard to keep up with,
That's
but
why we're here. Yeah.
I think it's easier if we think about it as maybe way too many things at once, but nonetheless, they're not individual. They are individual
It's
stories,
all
but
part of the same thing.
they're representative of a number of different things taking place. And so if we at least that helps calm the chaos a little bit. It doesn't make me less sad, but it does make me feel a little bit more like I can wrap my head around how to challenge
Exactly.
things.
Exactly. It's part of a bigger thing. And also, there are people like you who are at least grabbing as many of these as they can for when there is an accountability moment, because accountability is so crucial to this.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you
Elijah,
so
thanks so
much
much for so much time today. No, this was
Yeah.
great.
It's hopefully a little less glum way to
Oh,
end, but happy
great.
happy
Great's not
Pride.
the word, but yes.
Happy
Yes,
Pride.
happy Pride.
Yeah. Pride was a riot and everything sucked then too. So
Right.
Pride was a riot.
Started with a riot in Stonewall. Right.
It's not a new fight, but it's definitely a dark time.
It is. But Pride is going to keep going.
They're gonna keep going. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, man. Thank you so much for your time today. And
Absolutely.
thanks on behalf of WOLA for this.
No, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you again for listening. And many thanks to Elijah Maurus for sitting with us and giving such a clear, cogent explanation of what is. It's as complicated as it is momentous and devastating what is being inflicted on people who are trying to come to the United States just to feel safe for the first time in their lives. And the fact that that has become was already hard to do. It was very dangerous to do trying to get across Mexico, but now it is hard to do here inside the US system is a scandal, as I said, that really needs to be better known. And I really appreciate that Elijah was able to explain it as clearly as he did. Please do stay tuned. We're going to keep these podcast episodes coming as always. And as with all that WOLA produces and does, we do depend on donations to make these episodes and much else happen. So if you're a supporter, thank you for making this work possible. If you're not, just remember that you could be very easily. But either way, thank you for listening. Stay well and goodbye for now.